This war has not just been a military conflict between Israel and Hamas. I think it has really called on the diaspora of Islamic extremists around the world, as well as their new allies on the progressive left, to launch really an anti-Semitic propaganda war against the Jewish state and against Jews. Not just Israeli things, but Jews and Jewishness itself is under attack in a way that I don't think has been the case since the Second World War. What do you make of that?
Well, terrorists and I should say even mainstream Palestinian leaders have often viewed anti-Semitism as a form of leverage over Jewish communities and over Western policymakers. I was told about 20 years ago when I had breakfast with the Palestinian ambassador to South Africa, we met in Cape Town, and he warned me that if the United States didn't change its policy toward Israel, that there could one day be a Holocaust in the United States. Now, he was exploiting fears among Jews that even in the United States, which has been the most welcoming country to Jews out of any country outside of Israel and perhaps Canada, he was reacting or exploiting those fears that Jews still have, because Jews were very much at home in Germany, for example, before the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. And Jews often fear that something like that could happen again, no matter what other society they're living in. That's why Jews feel safer and more secure when Israel is safe and secure. But in his mind, that was something to be exploited, that the discomfort of Jewish communities in the West could be used to convince Israel not to be aggressive against Palestinian terrorism, because, after all, Israel would not want to do things that would harm fellow Jews around the world. So I think there is actually an unspoken strategic element to some of the anti-Semitism. Some of it is purely ideological and radically nationalist. There have been many attacks, for example, in even New York City, which is a city where Jews are very much a part of the cultural landscape, attacks on Israeli restaurants that serve falafel and hummus, because according to Palestinians, Israelis aren't allowed to enjoy those foods or to serve them in Israeli-style restaurants, because those foods are from the Middle East, and they view Israel as not being indigenous to the Middle East. Everything Israeli is fake and borrowed, never mind that the very Palestinian narrative itself of a Nakba, a disaster, as the founding of their nation, is borrowed in its own turn from the way in which the Holocaust preceded the creation of the State of Israel, although the pieces were already in place for the creation of the State of Israel before the Second World War. But the idea is to delegitimize Israel. And what you can say at best is that the academic institutions and some of the leading political institutions, and certainly the media institutions, are indifferent to the death of Jews in Israel. As the saying goes, Jewish lives don't matter. And of course, the opposite is true for other minorities for whom the establishment bends over backwards to show how much they care and how much they empathize, even with perceived suffering, if perhaps the objective reasons for suffering might be a matter of differences of opinion. There's no regard for the suffering of Israeli Jews. And you see that at the United Nations, where the UN's Women Organization ignored the attempted mass rape of Israeli women and the allegations, credible and some of them on video, of the sexual violence against Israeli women. So there is an anti-Semitism. Some of it is strategic and political, and some of it does go back to very old and very ugly prejudices against Jews that are simply religious prejudices or ethnic prejudices. And in many cases, in many ways, the Arab and Muslim diaspora has borrowed some of these anti-Semitic ideas from European anti-Semitism. And in some ways, they are indigenous to Islamic attitudes toward minority faiths in the Muslim world in general. Jews and Christians were never full citizens in the Muslim empires. They were second-class citizens. They may have had it better, especially Jews at some points in Islamic history, than they might have in Christian Europe, but they were never full citizens. And there's a powerful anti-Semitism that comes from within Islam, as well as from within the totalitarian ideologies of Europe or the authoritarian regime of Tsarist Russia, which originally promulgated the fraudulent text, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So a lot of anti-Semitism comes into this mix, and the leading academic lights in the United States failed to speak out forcefully against it. They failed to describe the nature of the problem. They treated anti-Israel and anti-Semitic speech as if it were a First Amendment problem, merely a matter of free speech. In fact, it's not even clear that calls for genocide, for example, are protected by the First Amendment. Certainly, calling for the destruction of Israel is an infringement on religious liberty because Israel is at the center of the Jewish faith and has been for thousands of years. And so if you're calling for the destruction of Israel, you're calling essentially to make it impossible or much more difficult, at least, for Jews to practice their faith. Many Jews feel that Judaism itself would not survive without the modern state of Israel because of the Holocaust. And so there's been a kind of failure, not just a moral failure by Arab and Muslim immigrants to the West who have brought with them some of the anti-Israel prejudices that they were steeped in, perhaps in their upbringing, but there's been a failure of the North American and European institutions to stand up for their own values, to stand up for American history. The very basis of religious liberty in the United States, going back to George Washington, is not just tolerance, but a complete assertion of the independent religious liberty of Jews. George Washington wrote a letter to the Jewish community at Newport, Rhode Island, promising them that Jews would always be safe in the United States. And that letter also says that people don't enjoy their religious liberty on the sufferance of others. It's not just that Jews are tolerated, but Jews have an independent God-given right to religious liberty. And Washington wrote that just a few months after he became president. And that reflects the spirit in which the First Amendment was adopted. So we've really lost a sense of not just what it means to live in a tolerant society, but we've lost a sense of where our own liberties come from. And we've allowed, in some cases, migrant communities to bring these illiberal ideas with them, but we haven't even stood up for our own ideas through our own institutions.
Yeah. You know, it was incredible. And I haven't done a show on the subject, but the presidents of MIT, Harvard, and Penn, three leading universities, just were incredible how they just would not bring themselves to condemn calls for genocide. I think there was one point where they said, well, if it turned into action, we would say something, but just calling for death to the Jews is not enough to trigger our harassment.
It's a little bit more than that. I mean, they condemned calls for genocide, but what they wouldn't say is that calls for genocide would be punished by the university. And what they tried to say was that it's a First Amendment issue. It's a free speech issue. People have the free speech to call for genocide. Yeah. Well, if you go to any of these campuses, you don't actually have freedom of speech. You can't misgender someone. You can lose your job for misgendering somebody. You can be brought up on administrative sanctions or whatever it is for all kinds of speech offenses. But somehow calling for the genocide of Jews is uniquely privileged as a form of freedom of speech. And of course, under First Amendment doctrine, incitement to immediate physical violence is not protected by the First Amendment. And in a lot of these contexts where you have crowds of anti-Israel demonstrators saying things like, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which is a call to genocide, and Jewish students have to make their way through this, that is an incitement to harm. And I've told my wife many times that had those protesters existed on campus when I was there, I probably would have been expelled for fighting, because those are fighting words.